Thank you, Karen, and thank all of you for gathering here. I especially want to thank Vera folks for inviting me to speak tonight, Karen talking me into it, and all of you for coming out a night like this to hear some of the thoughts I have on the topic that Vera's asked me to speak on. I want to thank the Harvard Club for hosting us, and let the folks at the Harvard Club know I'd have come more often if they hadn't rejected me out of high school. But I've recently gotten over that, so I'm moving past it. The topic that Vera's asked me to speak about tonight is integrity, public trust, and prosecution. And let me start trying to give you some thoughts on that difficult topic and grapple with it by starting with a story from my time as U.S. Attorney in Manhattan, working with great people like Karen and so many of the others who are here. About 50 new lawyers started during the time that I was U.S. Attorney. And I developed the habit, as tradition, practice, whatever you want to call it, of meeting with each of the new people on their first morning and talking to them about what my expectations were for them as they began this great career, either in the civil division or the criminal division, with this great U.S. Attorney's Office. And part of what I told them was, you are about to receive a remarkable gift, because when you stand up and identify yourself as the lawyer for the United States, something amazing is going to happen. Total strangers are going to believe what you say next. Whether it's a representation about what happened during a phone call, or a statement about what a case that's not in the courtroom stands for, or a proffer about the facts, you will be believed. And I don't want to burst your bubble, I would tell these young folks, but that is not because of you. That is because of hundreds of promises made, of representations made, and errors instantly corrected by hundreds, really thousands of people who went before you. Those people went before you, left you a gift that I call to them, and I still call, a reservoir of trust and credibility that makes it possible for you to stand up and say, I'm the lawyer for the United States, and be believed by judges, by juries, by witnesses, by people you don't even know standing at a cocktail party. That's a gift. And I would tell these young folks, look, remember that gift, but also remember that like any great gift, what comes with it is a responsibility. It is your sworn obligation to protect that reservoir and to pass it on to those who follow, who may never know you, but those who follow and will need that gift to do the great goods which are the purpose of this institution. How do you protect that gift, I would say to these folks? Simple. Always, always do the right thing. Don't you dare, I would say to them, ever make an argument you don't believe in. Don't you dare, ever, proffer facts that you don't know. Don't you dare say to a judge that a case from the Second Circuit stands for a certain proposition if you are not certain that it stands for that proposition. And don't you dare go ahead when your witness's story starts to change in ways that give you a bad feeling. You stop. I'm telling you as the U.S. Attorney, you are ordered to stop that day. I don't care how upset the judge gets, your adversaries get, your witnesses get, your agents get, you stop and you come back and you talk to us. Because no case, no argument, no nothing is worth damaging that gift. Because the problem with reservoirs is, it takes hundreds of people, in the case of the Southern District of New York, decades, hundreds of years, to fill that reservoir. One hole in the dam can drain that reservoir. The actions of one person can kill, can waste what's been earned by so many. Don't you dare do that. If they still want to work for us, I would give them a certificate. And I hope there are people here who still have the certificate on their wall. I gave them a certificate I found that was the words of one of my great predecessors, Whitney North Seymour. Mike Seymour had written a document called To Be an Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York, and he described what were the key attributes of discharging that job in the proper way. And his words obviously applied to assistant U.S. attorneys in the Southern District of New York, but they apply just as easily to any U.S. Attorney's Office or any prosecutor at state level, local level, or the federal level. And I want to read you part of what he said. He said, to be an assistant United States attorney for the Southern District of New York requires commitment to absolute integrity and fair play. to candor and fairness in dealing with adversaries and the courts, to careful preparation, not making any assumptions or leaving anything to chance, and never proceeding in a case unless convinced of the correctness of one's position or the guilt of the accused. Now, when I was lucky enough to get the fascinating job of Deputy Attorney General and to move to Washington, I took the notion of the reservoir with me because I thought, it applies across the entire Department of Justice. And I thought then and still think that people often forget just what the Department of Justice is. It is not those folks on Pennsylvania Avenue across from the FBI headquarters. It's 110,000 people spread all over the country doing all manner of jobs, thousands of whom are lawyers. Civil lawyers, criminal lawyers, forfeiture lawyers, all different kinds of lawyers representing the United States. That's the Department of Justice. And the department, like state attorneys general or district attorneys, does tremendous good. All of you know them, protecting our neighborhoods, protecting our country, enforcing the environmental laws, protecting people's civil rights, fighting discrimination, fighting corruption, all the things you know that are the great goods that institution gives to this country. But what I try to tell folks in Washington is that it only accomplishes those goods by winning cases. Criminal cases, civil cases, small cases, big cases, long cases, short cases. It accomplishes the great goods that make it such an important part of American life by men and women rising before juries and judges and identifying themselves as the lawyer for the United States and winning a case. Housing discrimination case, civil rights case, criminal case, False Claims Act case, you name it. That is, those hundreds of people winning hundreds of cases, the essence of the Department of Justice. The department as a whole, forget the leadership for a second, the department as a whole, in my experience, is resolutely apolitical to its core. Its leadership, of course, are political appointees, people appointed by a president to carry out that president's policy priorities for the Department of Justice. That's the way it should be. I hope that's the way it'll always be. A president will pick the people he or she thinks is best to be U.S. Attorney, best to be Deputy Attorney General, best to be Attorney General. But those men and women rising before juries and judges have to be different. When they rise, they can't be seen as anything other than the good guys. They can't be seen as the Republicans, the Democrats, the Greens, the anything other than an other in American life, a neutral in American life, the good guys in American life. Because the moment they are seen as anything else, when they rise, they have lost the ability to be believed by total strangers. When they rise and they are seen as a partisan player or the representative of a particular group, the reservoir has been drained. And I think the institution's place in American life has been jeopardized. That's what worried me so much about the controversy over the U.S. attorney firings. Not that people were taking shots at the department's leadership, or people were concerned that the White House may have had too much influence. Those are legitimate concerns, legitimate issues. But they will always be with us, to one degree or another, given the nature of our political enterprise. What worried me was that the controversy was making its way beyond that building on Pennsylvania Avenue and making its way into the field, into those U.S. attorneys' offices, maybe into those courtrooms where those men and women were going to rise and represent the United States. And I worried very much that there was a risk that when they rose, they would not be seen as an other in American life. They'd be seen as a partisan, and the reservoir would begin to drain. And there's no easy way back from the drain in the reservoir. No easy way to fix it, no window to go to get that back. I worried very much about that. I'm here to tell you today, my sense is, especially with the man we have as Attorney General today, that to the extent there was a hole in the reservoir, it's been stopped, been patched, and to the extent there was a loss in those courtrooms, it's being earned back by the work of those men and women. But to come back to where I started, why did I think it was so important to tell those AUSAs on their first day about the reservoir? Why did I think it was so important that they have Mike Seymour's words, that everybody get it, in cheapo government frames, but that everybody get it, and that everybody hang it on their walls? And you may be sitting there thinking, did he really worry about the Southern District of New York? which, if you know that office, has as part of its fabric the commitment to doing the right thing. I did that, I gave that speech, I gave that certificate, and I did worry because all people are flawed. And you may be sitting there thinking, yeah, there absolutely are some bad people out there. There are some evil people, and I'm sure some of them are prosecutors. And you're right, that I'm sure there exist in the rank of prosecutors bad people, evil people, because that's the way human beings can be. There are bad people. But in my entire career, I never met one. I never met, all over this country, private practice in the government, a prosecutor I thought was bent on doing something wrong, bent on screwing the innocent, bent on some sort of evil act. Instead, what I saw and met were a whole lot of human beings. I met a lot of flawed creatures who, I would suggest to you, like all of us, are at their most dangerous when they are certain their cause is just and certain that their facts are right. Mike Seymour's words, remember those about never proceeding unless convinced of the correctness of your position? Absolutely necessary, but not sufficient. Because people are creatures who can convince themselves of darn near anything, especially when they believe and are part of a noble calling. For that reason, I think it's a mistake to think that evil is the greatest threat to public trust and integrity in prosecution. I think the greatest threat is actually human nature. Innocent people get convicted. I know that from my experience as a prosecutor. My sense also, not sense, I know that it happens most often when the stakes are highest, when something awful has happened. Someone's been killed, a child's been brutalized, some awful crime has happened. And the pressures in that case are such that even the best intentioned of participants make mistakes and misjudgments that harden into strong belief under the pressure of that case. Because it is absolutely a fact that people who are absolutely committed to doing the right thing can make a mistake and do the wrong thing. I think we need to look for ways, both procedural and institutional, to channel the way we conduct, especially the most difficult cases, to reduce the risks of those kind of misjudgments hardening into miscarriages. Simple things on the procedural side, like thinking about the way we conduct identifications, thinking about the way we conduct interrogations and memorialize interrogations. And this is well beyond my ken. I know there's very important work being done by people who know this well, incredibly important work, including by people here. And I think those changes, those suggestions may make an important difference. But I want to talk to you about something else. More than focusing on those rules, because people are flawed, I think we also need to constantly worry about the culture of our institutions. Culture is something that's harder to talk about, a little bit of a marshmallow, harder to get your arms around and study. But not only no less important, I would suggest to you more important. The best definition of culture that I've heard is the way things are really done around here. Put another way, culture is the way we do things no matter what they tell you in training. Every office has a culture, every organization has a culture, every prosecutor's office, federal, state, or local, has a culture. In fact, they usually have subcultures. Narcotics different than organized crime different from securities frauds, but all of them have culture. And culture is shaped not by listening to lectures, not by watching training videos, but by watching how people act. My first morning speech, because I gave it, I thought was a wonderful thing. But all the lectures in the world on your first morning, your second morning, all of your mornings are nothing in the face of one encounter between a new prosecutor and her supervisor over whether the new prosecutor needs to disclose a piece of evidence that might be exculpatory. When that new prosecutor is met by a look, a shrug, or maybe a whatever, that the new prosecutor reads as, we don't give stuff to guilty scum to tank our cases and allow their weasel lawyers to muck up the works. Okay? All the training videos, all the speeches are totally wasted. All of the speeches by your well-meaning U.S. attorney are wasted if that junior lawyer sits in a prep session and watches the senior preps somebody and watches as the testimony in the prep starts to drift in ways that are helpful without any pushback from the senior. Or watches as the senior leaves a witness statement, an FBI 302, on a table for a different witness to look at while they take a break. I have a bunch of kids. Proud to say I was a kid. I know from trying to raise 5 children that kids are not shaped by lectures. They're not shaped by rule books. They're shaped by witnessing hundreds and hundreds of conversations, encounters, looks, gestures, facial expressions. They're shaped in thousands of different ways. All of us who are parents think and worry about character, right? Character, I think, is best defined as the way you act when nobody is looking. Character is also another way to think about culture, because character is the way you really do things when you're not being overseen. Will our children have the character to do the right thing when we're not there or when a teacher is not there because of the values we've instilled in them? We worry about that. Training a corps of ethical prosecutors by focusing exclusively on the rules for discovery and impeachment is like trying to raise good kids by having them read the penal code. Enron had a wonderful set of compliance guidelines. I suspect the Durham County, North Carolina's District Attorney's Office had terrific training on discovery. Culture is the way things are really done. Those of us who care about integrity in prosecution can't forget that ever, and must focus on constantly sending messages that reinforce the positive aspects of our culture and that reinforce the rules so that the way things are really done around here is the same thing as the way we train you to do things around here. The challenge of culture is you can't touch it, you can't taste it, you can't feel it, you can't see it. I liken it to air. It's everywhere, it's invisible, it's essential to life, but it goes bad in ways that are invisible to the people surrounded by that air. My favorite example is what happens when you step into a room where someone has been filleting fish. Okay? It's the nastiest thing imaginable. You walk in and you say, what on earth is that smell? And what does your partner, spouse, friend who is cutting the fish say? What are you talking about? I don't smell anything. Now, why didn't they smell that? Because it got stinky bit by bit by bit. That is the way culture goes bad. Having stepped into some corrupt cultures, as a lot of people here have in their career as investigators or in private practice, you notice the smell right away. But good people inside that air are like your friend cutting the fish. They don't see it. That should make all of us who care about running prosecutors' offices to worry about culture obsessively, because you will not know when that air starts to drift in the wrong way. And let me just offer you one small example of how I try to do that as U.S. Attorney. Karen alluded to this. One of the great traditions of the office here in Manhattan is that everybody does come and see the U.S. Attorney after a verdict. Any kind of case, it's supposed to be win or lose. And I found out early in my tenure that some people weren't showing up for acquittals. People weren't coming to see me because, as Karen said, they don't feel good about an acquittal. You know, everyone wants to high five and dance around. When you have an acquittal, I don't want to go see the U.S. Attorney. Right? And so I took some steps to order that everybody come. And then, as Karen said, I made a very big deal out of the acquittals. I would tell people I was proud of them, and I meant this, because that tells me that you tried a hard case, that you had the guts to do something that justice required. And I would say, look, I'm assuming the cause is just. If it ain't just, we ought not to be having this conversation. But if the cause is just, I appreciate you giving it an effort. I have very little patience for those who walk around saying I'm 35 and up, because it tells me you're either a remarkable trial lawyer, which could be, or you never tried a hard case. And I want my people to take chances sometimes. So I would tell them, and I'd tell them I love acquittals, I would tell them, I actually had some people come back the third time, and I'd say, we might need to reorient here. It's okay if you have an acquittal. But I did that because I wanted to send a culture of risk-taking. But there was actually another reason I did it that I didn't tell my assistants. And that is this. I worried very much that in the macho culture that can grow up in U.S. attorneys' offices, that I'm something and owe badge of honor, that I worry, creates a situation where that prosecutor with a difficult case to try, sitting alone in his or her office on a quiet Saturday afternoon, who's come across a document that really ought to go to the defense, may hear a still small voice saying things that I don't want them hearing. I don't want them worrying about losing that case. I want them doing the right thing. So I thought maybe one of the ways I can influence that culture in a positive way is celebrate acquittals. Don't worry about it. Give it your best shot. I wanted to reinforce the notion, as the Supreme Court said in Berger in 1935, that our AUSAs should be, quote, those whose interest in a criminal prosecution is not that they shall win a case, but that justice shall be done. I worried very much, even though I was the head of an elite office. Okay? I mean, I had the virtue of a very rigorous hiring process where I tried to hire people whose parents had gotten it right, who came to me as young people of character. That's absolutely true. I had great people. I had remarkable people. At the same time, though, I had people. And I knew that those people, especially as they moved up in the ranks of that U.S. Attorney's Office, were going to face challenges, pressures that they needed help with. And I knew this because I had seen up close in my career extraordinary pressures lead to an extraordinary injustice. Let me tell you a story from my time in Richmond, Virginia. In 1990, an elderly black woman named Eloise Cooper was in her house in the near west end of Richmond, largely African-American neighborhood. And a car pulled up front, driven by a white guy, and another white guy got out with a knife and pushed in the door, went up the stairs through the house, and grabbed Mrs. Cooper out of her bed, it was 3 in the morning, and dragged her in front of her invalid husband out the door, pushed her into the car, and they drove off. There were 2 eyewitnesses, a single mother who lived next door, and a guy who was walking on the street. And Eloise Cooper was found the next morning in a nearby park, stabbed to death. This crime outraged the community in Richmond, Virginia. And the city responded by assigning a team of detectives, including a legendary, really a legendary homicide investigator, to begin the hunt for the killer. They got a tip the next day, as a matter of fact, that the killing had been an act of revenge by drug dealers who had gotten ripped off by a drug dealer and thought Eloise Cooper's house was the drug dealer's house, and had gone there looking for the drug dealer, and when he wasn't there, they grabbed his mother or his grandmother, they didn't care, and they dragged her out and they killed her. It turned out that it was a mistake, that these killers were at the wrong address, that the drug dealer's house was actually 3 houses down. The informant gave them the name of a suspect, and it was a name well known to the police in the Richmond area. And they started investigating that suspect and trying to figure out who his friends were and his associates. And as they did that work, they came to find that the suspect had an acquaintance, not really a friend, but somebody he knew, named Jeff Cox. And Cox was a person with no criminal record and with a job, regular job, long-standing job as an air conditioning repairman. And they took photos of him at a job site. And they took those photos and they showed them to the 2 eyewitnesses. Now the reason they did this is they thought, looking at Cox, that he resembled a sketch that one of the witnesses had done to the police detective. So they take photos, they show them to the 2 witnesses. They both identify Jeff Cox as the man who dragged Eloise Cooper out of her house at 3 in the morning. So Jeff Cox is arrested. The police kept no record of that identification, other than to note in their report that the witnesses viewed photos and positively identified Jeff Cox. So Cox is locked up, charged with first-degree murder. Prosecution had no weapon, no forensics, no motive evidence in connection with Jeff Cox. The prosecutor's trial file, which I saw years later, was a single manila folder with about 3 sheets of paper in it. Cox hired a lawyer who was very busy and tried his case during a break in a death penalty case that the lawyer was handling elsewhere in Richmond. The case took 2 days. The prosecutor put on the 2 eyewitnesses. Cox called his girlfriend as an alibi. Jury convicted him. He was sentenced to life in prison. End of story, right? Nearly 10 years later, an FBI agent came into my office in Richmond who had been investigating something unrelated and had come across the Cox case and had looked into it a little bit and came to tell us that he was convinced that an innocent man was in prison for life. And he convinced us, me, to open a grand jury investigation on the flimsy excuse that it was a drug-related killing, or at least might have been, and everybody agreed there was one perpetrator who had not been apprehended. So it was assigned to a fabulous assistant U.S. attorney who worked for me, named Bob Trono. And Bob and this agent from the FBI set out and proved beyond all possible doubt that Jeff Cox was innocent, and developed powerful evidence inculpating 2 other people, including the guy on whom the police had gotten the tip the first day. So with this new evidence, they discussed it, we discussed the matter with the police and the local prosecutor to handle the case. The police were outraged that we were using federal resources to help this white guy who was clearly guilty of killing an elderly black woman in Richmond. The eyewitnesses, one of whom I interviewed, both of whom were African American, were similarly outraged at me for spending the resources and accusing them of getting their testimony wrong, and said very unpleasant things about why we were doing that. The prosecutor's reaction was odd. He said, I guess I thought he was guilty at the time of trial, but I always thought he would flip. And that was why we brought the case, really. And I had some doubts, but I figured that's what juries are for. And so the jury resolved it and convicted Jeff Cox. So we went to the Commonwealth of Virginia, and they told us we are not freeing Jeff Cox until someone else's guilt is established in a conclusive way by proceedings, in a way that precluded Cox's guilt. So my assistant U.S. attorney, Bob Trono, was cross-designated as a local prosecutor and went over and indicted, tried, and convicted a guy named Stephen Hood. Key piece of evidence against Hood was a statement he made that he had participated as the driver, naming the guy who had the knife and kidnapped Mrs. Cooper. And explained, yeah, we did it, we got beat by this guy in a drug deal, we were furious. So the other guy said, we're going to take revenge, and that's what we did. After that, the Commonwealth of Virginia released Jeff Cox after 11 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And I should add, we never made the case against the guy who had dragged Mrs. Cooper out of the house, even though to this day I know who he is. Now, why do I tell you this story? Not because it illustrates the perils of witness identification and the challenging dynamics of race in a criminal justice case, although it does, and maybe in ways that surprised you. I tell it instead because it shows, to me at least, the risk that the best intentions of people can bring about injustice, and in particular to highlight the pressures facing the prosecutor confronting a horrific crime, passionate investigators, and confident witnesses, all of which can quickly overwhelm a nagging sense that something isn't right here. It is easy for me to say from comfortable hindsight that that prosecutor, a white man, should have told the detectives, should have told the witnesses, should have told the husband, the distraught husband of Mrs. Cooper, and should have told the African American community in Richmond that he didn't feel right about charging Jeff Cox with that crime, and needed more evidence, and that he was not going to shift his moral responsibility to the jury. It's easy for me to say from here that he should have had the guts to go to the DA, who's elected in Richmond, and say, I'm tanking this case because I don't feel right about it. I don't know what photo identification was used. I just don't feel good about this. But I got to tell you, that judgment requires a whole lot of time and distance, and is probably not fair to the prosecutor, who I believe was a good person. I guess I can't honestly say, as I sit here this many years after the fact, how I would have handled similar pressures, how any of us would have handled similar pressures. But what the Cox case teaches me for sure is that the job of a leader of prosecutors is to remember the Cox cases, to remember the natural human tendency to make our worst mistakes when we are sure that we are doing the right thing in the most important of causes. And to do that, we need the right procedures to channel our prejudices, our tendency to make an error, so that identifications are reliable, so that interrogations are fair, so that witnesses tell the truth, so that exculpatory evidence gets disclosed. But far more than that, we need to understand that the essential duty of leadership is building and supporting prosecutors of character and never missing an opportunity to remind our folks that they are, as the Supreme Court also said in Berger, in a peculiar and very definite sense, the servant of the law, the twofold aim of which is that guilt shall not escape or innocence suffer. Effective prosecution, the achievement of those great goods that are done across this land by prosecutors, requires public trust. It requires a sense among ordinary folks that the prosecutor is an other, is a neutral in their life, who cares only about facts and not about race or about status or about politics. It also requires public confidence that the prosecutor is committing to getting those facts right. In short, I think that effective prosecution requires both an appreciation of the fragile nature of that reservoir of trust and credibility and a relentless attention to healthy culture. I'm here to report, though, that my experience over 20 years touching this work is that while we can always be better, we are fortunate indeed to have prosecutors all over this country who are passionately committed to those values. Thank you, too, for caring about them. Thank you.
Staying down there. So thank you so much, and on behalf of the Vera Institute and all its staff and board members, we'd like to give you this small token of our appreciation, not just for your wonderfully insightful and engaging talk tonight, but also for all your years of public service. Thank you so much. Thank all of you for coming. For those of you who want to sort of keep track of the events we have or learn more about Vera, I would encourage you to check out our website to keep abreast of these sorts of events. And again, thank you all for coming, and get home safely. Thank you.